Thank you. So I will start with defining these terms because they might not be familiar to everyone. So what is a fault injection? Okay, it's a security concept. So let's take a look at this small program. What it does is compare the pin that you entered to unlock, for instance, your phone or maybe your credit card with an expected pin that's stored somewhere in the memory. We assume that the two are the same length. Yeah? Okay. We assume that the two are the same length, and this code should be relative. So at the start, you set an OK flag to 1, and if ever one character differs between the entered and the expected, you set OK to 0, and at the end, you return OK. And so if you're an attacker, of course, what you want to do is to make this function returns OK equals 1, even if you didn't enter the correct pin. So is that possible? Well, actually, if you have physical access to the card, this is possible by using a technique called fault injection, where you typically disrupt the processor using physical means. So it could be glitching its clock signal, or maybe firing a laser at it at a very precise time and place. And this would disrupt the processor, disrupt the execution of well-chosen instruction. And so it could mean skipping this instruction or modifying what it does. In this specific example, what the attacker might want to do is to disrupt the conditional test that's generated by the for loop, to invert it. So if you invert it at the first iteration, you will skip the whole loop, you will exit from the loop immediately, and you never do any of the tests inside, so you return OK equals 1 immediately. And you won as the attacker. So of course, for this example, there's a really simple protection against this particular attack. You could just add the test at the very end here that checks that the value of I at the end is indeed equal to pin length. And if it is not, it means something fishy happened during the execution of the loop, and you can exit maybe with an error message. Okay, so adding this piece of code here at the end, it's what is called hello? Yeah. Here I added the countermeasure in the source code, but you include countermeasures directly in the hardware, or you could also add countermeasures during the compilation to unprotected source code, and that's what we do. And if you do so, there's actually two properties that you might want to prove from these countermeasures. You might want to prove that they are correct in the sense that if there's no fault, adding a countermeasure actually doesn't change the semantics or the behavior of the program that you're protecting. And the second property is that the countermeasure is actually efficient. It does protect from the attack in a certain sense that we will define later. And so we've been working on implementing countermeasures and proving these two properties in the context of the CompCert verified compiler, which is implemented in the ROC interactive theorem prover. So for people who are not very familiar with CompCert, it's a compiler for the C language. It has a bunch of intermediate languages ranging from C to assembly language at the end. But today we'll only focus on one specific intermediate language, RTL, here on the right, which is a language where most of the optimization of CompCert are done and where we also implemented our countermeasures. So RTL looks like this on the bottom. Programs are represented by control flow graphs of instructions. So here the example corresponds to the verify pin function at the top. And you can see that in every node of the control flow graph, you have a single instruction, which could be an operation or assigning a register, or a conditional test. So in particular, here you have two conditional tests. The one on the left corresponds to the for loop, and the one on the right corresponds to the if inside of the for loop. And you have a lot of other kinds of instruction, but today we'll mostly be concerned with operands and conditional tests. Okay, and so in this language, we implemented two countermeasures from the literature. The first one is the intra-procedural control flow checking, which was first introduced in a paper called Swift, and later improved for cybersecurity purposes. And so it actually protects against the exact kind of attacks that I described in the introduction, so inverting a conditional test. And the way it works is by essentially doubling the test. Instead of testing once, you do the test twice, And you assume that even if the attacker could invert the test once, it will be more difficult for him or her to invert the test twice in a row. So that's why we consider that it protects effectively. In practice, it's implemented like so. So the idea is to attribute a signature to each basic block in your source program. So here we chose 33 for the block before the test and 42 and 78 for the blocks after the test. And then you will generate a code that looks like this. So let's detail it. This signature 33, it characterizes at every time the basic block in which the execution is. And so we store it in a special register introduced by this compilation pass, which here is number x1 at the top right here, which we call the general signature register. And then, so you do a pretest. And depending on the result of this pretest, you will assign to another new register x2, which we call the transfer signature, the register transfer signature, value that is composition of the signature of the source block and the signature of the target block where you're supposed to go. And this composition, it's actually just a XOR operation because XOR is very practical, it's easily invertible. Then you go back to the same to a test, and then you do the test a second time. So indeed, you protect from an attack against a single test because you do it twice. And depending on this test, you will XOR the GSR with so x1 with x2. And so here on the left, normally, since x1 was equal to 33 at the start, it should now be equal to x2. If it's not, it means something fishy happened. One of the tests was inverted, and we can go into catch, which essentially raises a kind of error message. So you should be convinced that this countermeasure actually protects against inverting a single test somewhere in this. It actually protects against some other kind of attacks, which is quite popular, called return-oriented programming. So without going into too much detail, the idea is to override the return address somewhere in the stack, or at least several return addresses, and to use them to jump around in functions to execute some code that the attacker might be interested in running. And this actually protects from that because if you insert a check of the GSR at the very end of the function, just before a return, it means the attacker that jumps in the middle of a function, this break of the control flow will be detected by the countermeasure. But it doesn't really protect if the attacker jumps at the very start of the function because that's where GSR was initialized. And so to protect against this, we implemented a second version of the countermeasure, which I will not go into too much into detail, but the idea is essentially the same. You have some signatures for each function at the entry point and exit point, and you compose them and you check that you entered the correct function and that you exited from the correct function. Okay. So these are the implementations. We did that in CompCert, and now we want to prove that they are semantically correct in the sense of CompCert. So CompCert comes with an end-to-end correctness proof, which essentially says that the behavior of the target and source program are the same. And this proof is composed of a bunch of simulation proof, one for each compilation pass, that relates the semantics of the source and the target of the compilation pass. And so to explain this more, I need to show you what the semantics looks like. It's a small step semantics, so for every language of CompCert, it's a small step semantics, except maybe for the very source language, but for RTL it is. And so it's a sequence of rewriting steps that will transform a state, so S0, S1, S2, which represent essentially the state of the machine that's executed the code. So for RTL, this state is quite high level. You have a representation of the stack, which is this big sigma here. You have the functions that you're in, F, the program counter, so the identifier of the current instruction to be executed, PC, the set of registers, and the memory of the machine. And for every step, you may or may not see some observable events, which would be maybe writing to a global variable or doing a print or something, which are characterized in this trace T1, T2, T3, etc., etc. And here are two examples of the rules that gives these steps. So the first one is for the operand instruction, just applying an operand from the architecture from the ASA to some registers, and you just evaluate the operand on the values of the argument register. This should give you a value in return. You put it in the destination register, and you jump to the next, to the successor of this operation, which is L. And the second rule is for the conditional instruction. So you have a conditional with a condition, some argument register, and two destination, L1 and L2. You evaluate the condition. It should give you a Boolean value B. And then, depending on this B, you jump either to L1 or to L2 in the next state of the machine. And so for each pass of COMSURT, you must establish a simulation which shows that the behavior of the source and target program are the same. And usually it's basically building this kind of simulation diagram where you have at left S1 and S2 are states of the source program. At right, S1 prime and S2 prime are state of the target program. And you establish, you write a relation, so it depends of your compilation path, this tilde relation between them. And so you must prove that for any steps in the source program from S1 to S2 with a certain trace, you have a sequence of steps from S1 prime to S2 prime with the same trace, which leads you back into a state that's still related to S2. In practice, my experience is that the most difficult part of any proof is actually finding this relation. So here is a small example of the relation for our own compilation passes. For the intra-procedural, it's not that complicated. So we say that two states are in relation if their stacks are in relation and their registers are in relation in the following sense. So two sets of registers are in relation if for any register that already appeared in the source program, the values of the register in the target and source program are the same because we are just adding some new registers. So this part is easy. We will always have the same values for the source registers. And then we also have a register associated to the GSR, which should always be equal to the value of the signature associated with the PC, with the current program counter. And then the relation between sigma and sigma prime is just propagating this kind of relation up the stack frames. So this one is quite easy. For the interprocedural CFC, it's actually far more complicated because of the way we interleave new call to functions, which changes the shape of the stack and the shape of the memory layout at the same time. So we have to use fairly complex system of COMSURT, which is called memory injection, but I will not detail it too much in the presentation. And there's another complexity that we encountered when writing these proofs, which was to reason on the actual syntactic transformation. So let's forget about the semantic for this slide. Let's just look at what our program is syntactically. So our program is a control flow graph, which is expressed in COMSURT essentially as a map from node identifiers to actual instructions. And the way it's transformed, the first version of our transformation, we implemented it using a state monad because Coq is a pure functional language. So whenever we want to do some sort of global state transformation, we need a state monad. And we use it essentially to generate new program counters from new instruction. This is kind of mandatory, and this is what is done in most of compilation passes of COMSURT. But then it's quite tedious to reason with it because the state monad, you make your transformation somehow a bit global, while you would like to reason locally on part of the graph you rewrite. And so instead, we proposed a new framework in COMSURT, which is based on instruction to sequence rewriting. So if tomorrow you want to write a compilation pass in RTL, you might find this framework useful. The idea is that so if you want to write a new compilation pass, you will just provide some functions that says for each type of instruction how it is rewritten into somehow a sequence of instruction. So here on the left, I wrote it in a textual representation, but we introduced a new AST to represent these sequences of instruction, which may contain some conditional in the middle. And so this is this part in orange is specific to the transformation that you would like to implement. And the part in the bottom in blue is generic. So from this transformation, it actually generates a function that will transform the whole graph. And it gives you a specification which relates the source and target graph transformed, and a proof of this specification. So this automates somehow the reasoning about the graph transformation, and we found it quite practical in practice. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about the robustness proof. I just talked about correctness, but now let's talk about what was most interesting to us. We wanted to characterize that our countermeasures were actually efficient against some attacker models. And to establish that, to prove that in Coq, we must first define what is an attacker model in Coq. And it's actually not that complex. I said earlier that the behavior of a program was characterized by the sequence of steps with some observable events. Well, a fault is actually a special kind of step with an observable event. Careful, there is a fault here, which you can see on the trace, which will lead us in a new sequence of steps different from the one that should normally have been taken from the canonical behavior of the program. And so to introduce new attacker models, we just introduced some new rules, some new step rules with these faults. So here is the one for the inversion of a conditional. It's exactly the same as the rule for conditionals that we saw a few slides earlier, except at the end here, L2 and L1 are inverted. And so we define what it means for a program to be attacked, and now we can define what it means for a program to be protected against an attack. It essentially means if ever there's somewhere a fault in our execution, then if we continue to step, if the program continues to execute, it will always end up in a state where the fault has been caught. Special state that we introduce, which essentially means we went to this special catch instruction that I showed in the example. And most importantly, we do this new sequence of steps without doing any observable event. Here's the trace on the bottom. You can see that it's empty, because if there's an observable event on this trace, it means probably the attacker managed to leak some secret or to do something to the machine that we didn't want to happen. There's actually a second case that's a bit more marginal, at least in the example that we showed. You could imagine some fault attacks that don't actually have any real effect. And so you can characterize that by saying, actually, we will return to one of the normal states from the source execution while doing exactly the same trace. And if we're in this case, it's OK. We can also accept this. OK, and so here is the theorem that we want to prove. Proving this theorem means a program is robust against a certain kind of attack. And so the proof for this theorem is actually the structure of the proof was actually the same for the three attacker models that we described in the paper. So the inversion of conditional and two attackers model for attacks on function calls. But I will just show the example for the intra-procedural, so inversion of conditional from before. As the proof is a bit complex, there's a few complexities. The first is that there's a bit of combinatorial work to be done there, because if you look at this code, actually, you could imagine that the attacker attacks at 3 different points, 4 actually. Every time there's a conditional, you could imagine an attack, so it could be here, it could be here, it could be here, or on the left side. But let's just talk about this case, and the others are treated more or less the same. So now let's imagine the reasoning that we have to do when we are here. What we want to prove is that if this was attacked here, actually, the red part should be on the left, sorry. But we actually get into the catch at the end. And so to prove that we actually get to the catch at the end, we must prove that the condition x1 equals 78 evaluates different from 78 evaluates to true. And to prove that, of course, we need to know the value of x1. And to do that, if you look at the instruction just above, we need to know the values of x1 and x2. So the value of x2, we can see it easily. It's just above our fault that we injected here. So it should be easy to recover it. Actually, it's a bit technical because of the way the semantic model is encoded. But we wrote a bunch of reusable lemmas and tactics, and it allows us to do our inversion of the semantic derivation and to recover the value of x2. But for X1, it's more difficult because, as you can see, it's not assigned here in this small local part of the program. It was assigned way earlier. Maybe last time there was a conditional test or at the start of the program. But locally, we cannot find the value of X1. Fortunately, if you remember, in the correctness proof, in the invariant, a few slides earlier, we had the property. We knew what the value of GSR was. It's always equal to the signature associated with the current program counter. And so to recover it, what we needed to do was to propagate the information from the correctness proof to the robustness proof. These are two separate proofs. But to be able to propagate this information, what we did is introduce a new instruction, assert, which encodes that a condition must always be true. If this instruction is the condition x1 equal to 33 here at the top is not true, the program doesn't have a semantic. And so to establish the proof, we prove that this condition is true during the correctness proof. This is trivial because we already have the invariant. And then our local inversion allows us to recover the property. And now we know the value of x1 just by local inversion on the semantic derivation of this piece of code. OK, so that's it for the proof. To reiterate, what we proved is that after the compilation pass that adds the countermeasure, the program is actually protected against the attack model. Now the question is the program at the very end of the compilation chain, the program emitted by CompCert, actually protected against this attack model? This is actually what we're interested about. And the answer is we're not really sure, because in particular, CompCert is an optimizing compiler. It's not the most optimizing compiler, but it does some optimization. And any optimizing compiler could tell you that actually these two conditionals here should always evaluate to the same value. So I can just remove the second one. And our countermeasure is already broken. We already lost. Too bad. This is actually a general problem with people who write countermeasures, even in the source code, to fight against this kind of optimization. So we just wanted to quantify when it actually happened in CompCert. And to do that, we plugged CompCert to Lazar, which is a tool to do some symbolic fault injection on LLVM programs and test if some attack objectives are reached. So I will not go into too much detail in the transformation. But here are the results. So first, one good news. If we turn off the optimization of CompCert and we activate our countermeasures, there's no single fault attack scenarios left when we test with Lazar. There are some two-fault attack scenarios because you can just invert two of the tests in our countermeasures, and it works, but no single fault, and that was our goal, so we're happy about that. But as soon as we activate the optimization of CompCert back, then the one-fault attack come back, at least for some examples. So we managed to fix this issue by following an approach from an earlier paper, which is essentially to opacify a bit the program by adding some opaque copies which behave as movies in the final executable, but the compiler is not supposed to notice that. And so this allows us to somehow hide from CompCert the fact that there are some redundancies in the countermeasures, and so it doesn't optimize them anymore. And this seems to be working, at least for the few tests that we ran. OK, so to conclude, in our work, we proposed a methodology with a bunch of new interesting tools in CompCert to implement countermeasures, but also maybe other kind of passes, and to prove the correctness and robustness, which was a real new thing, of these countermeasures. We applied it to two specific countermeasures, mostly focused on control flow checking. But we believe that our methodology could be applied easily to other kind of countermeasures, so instruction counters, load duplication, calculation duplication, etc., etc. If you want to implement one of these countermeasures yourself, because you're interested in these questions, you can find all of the codes online at this pretty long URL. But there are still some interesting questions. And the main one that we are now interested about is what I talked about in the last few slides, the question of end-to-end correctness. So end-to-end robustness. So is the program at the very end of the compilation chain actually protected from fault injection? By testing with Lazar, it seems to be, but we don't have a formal proof of it yet. And of course, this makes us sad. And so there's a question if we could extend our work with opaque copies and somehow formally characterize what these opaque copies do and if it actually protects the countermeasures from optimization. And the end goal would be to have a theorem for each compilation pass in CompCert that says that if the source program is robust, then the target program is robust. And then composing these theorems with the countermeasure robustness theorems would give us a theorem at the end that says the very last program generated by CompCert is robust against this or this scenario. Of course, if we want to prove this theorem for each compilation pass in CompCert, there's a lot of work because there's a lot of compilation pass in CompCert, and there's also a lot of different attack models that we may want to tackle. So there's a problem of combinatorial explosion there. And so there's a question if we can make the proof somehow free by integrating it with a robustness proof, maybe somehow following the approach described in this paper, which was more focused on, the proof of preservation of the constant time property inside CompCert. But we're not completely sure yet that their approach applies to our work. I mean, to the question of robustness against fault injection. Okay, thank you very much, and I'm ready for questions.
Thanks for the talk. I know where some of my friends who I'm going to tell about this are going to ask. So the very first question is, I see you've got you are applying possible state transitions. You're like, what does a fault injection look like? And you're modeling that with like a mapping between states. What about fault injections inside of the program code itself? Do you think this approach would extend to not just the state modifications, but program modifications?
I think in general, you mean some kind of permanent transformations that would change the text of the code itself?
I mean, like in a von Neumann style system where you're possibly modifying the particular instruction that's going to be loaded.
Yeah, but you mean you're not modifying it just during this execution. You're modifying for all time, and if it's in a loop, it will be modified every time the loop...
Yeah, potentially.
Okay. Yeah. It's not completely clear if you could do that with this characterization. I think you would probably need to, if you wanted to use this kind of model to characterize what you just said, I think you would probably need to encode it with some multi-fault. So instead of saying you have a single fault which modifies this instruction, you have, I don't know, n faults which always do the same thing. So that would be probably the only characterization that you could do if you still want to encode your fault injection like this. Otherwise, maybe you could model this actually by injecting the fault on the instruction that calls the function, because actually you can see that so the part that tells you which instruction you're about to execute is here. So it's f.code = PC. So you could model this attack by saying, when you jump into the function f, you modify the text of the function f here. So I don't have the rule for the function call in my slides, but it essentially retrieves f from the global context. And so here you could modify it and say, the code of f has been modified.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I was wondering about this plan that you sort of described at the end for like robustness preserving compilation. I'm pretty sure that most of the current passes of CompCert are not robustness preserving. Is there evidence that like this is actually a feasible strategy for building a compiler to begin with? Like, are there compilers that are robustness preserving, or at least seem like they would be, such that attempting to prove it is not completely unreasonable because the theorem's false?
Okay, so first it depends of your definition of robustness, of course, which is parameterized by which attacker model you actually consider. So the answer is it depends also what you define as a compiler. For me, a compiler is a sequence of paths, so I could say compsert -O0 is a compiler that's robustness preserving for some compilation passes. But yeah, the point the problem that you point to is real. Compsert is not robustness preserving. We saw it when we ran our experiment, the question is, the question now is what we would like to prove. The real result is compsert with inserted opaque copies robustness preserving, if we insert them in the right place. That might be true, because, I mean, experimentally, this is true for these 4 programs. That might be true in general. We don't have the proof. That's what we want to get. So that's what we want to prove. And so, as I said in the last slide, the most relevant previous work is this work, but it was focused on the preservation of the constant time property. And so in this work, there's a really nice, not trick, but encoding, where they encode the leaks as observable event, a bit like we encode fault as observable event. And they use that to say, transformation passes preserve the trace, including the leaks, or remove some leaks. And so this means that the leaks, the compilation is leak preserving, so it's constant time preserving, essentially. It doesn't add any new leaks. But it's not clear to me that, so even if we encode as the same way as encode leaks as observable events, we encode faults as observable events, it's not clear to me that the same strategy applies for faults, because for faults, you essentially quantify on executions, and I don't think that's exactly the case in this article. But yeah.
I would also have a question regarding robust preserving compilation. So this robust preservingness, did you prove that for your own transformation, that you can iteratively apply that? You say if you apply it once, then you have a fault tolerance of at least 1 fault injection, and if I apply it another time, then I just add 1 more number.
No, I didn't, because we didn't give a specification. So that's the implied question in your question. We didn't give a specification of multi-fault attacks. Our robustness theorem here, it only works for single fault attacks. And so we haven't written yet the version for multi-fault attacks, but we believe that it would be more complicated because you need somehow to count the attacks, and you have some combinatorial which says when did one fault occur, when did the next one occur. So we didn't give this definition, and therefore we couldn't prove what you proposed. And I think the proof would probably be quite complicated, but I haven't thought about it in detail. So.
Okay, so let's take the other questions on offline, and let's go to our third talk, which is an online talk.